Hello there, welcome to session number 6, where we're going to be looking at how to make sense of the ways in which problematic and addictive substance use can affect a family. Now, this can happen in many ways, but the particular way I'm going to share with you today is looking at the way the relationship can be affected between yourself and the person who's got into difficulty with their substance use. Now, as ever, I'm going to be offering you general information, and you'll need to decide how much of it applies to the situation that you're in and how you're then going to respond to that. I'm going to start by sharing a general idea about all relationships, and then I'll come on and apply that to relationships with someone who's got into difficulty with their substance use. And then, as usual, I will end the session by posing some questions for you to consider. Okay, let's come on and look at the first slide. Okay, so here is a general idea about all relationships. It's the idea that it takes two to tango. And what I mean by that is that whatever happens in a relationship is created by both of the people in that relationship. This is because each person influences the other and is also influenced by them. But notice that each person is only responsible for their part in what happens and is not responsible for the other person's part. Sometimes we're not aware of the influence that we have on someone else, or maybe we're not aware of the influence that they have on us. Okay, I'd like to explain that idea that it takes two to tango just a little bit further by looking at the relationship that I'm in right now with you. What I hope we're both creating is some training whereby you're learning something about the relationship between yourself and the person in your life who you're concerned about, who's got into difficulty with their substance use. Now let's think about, how do we both create this training? Notice that I offer you something, and I'm hoping you're sitting there feeling engaged and taking part and listening to what I'm saying, and then thinking about what it is that I've said. And if that is what's happening, then notice how we both create the training. It takes both of us. I need to offer it, you need to receive it. Notice also where the responsibility lies. I'm responsible for how I deliver this session. If I make a hash of that, that's not your responsibility. But likewise, if you're sitting there not really engaging in what I'm saying, not listening, and then not reflecting and thinking about what I've said, that's not my responsibility. But if we're both fulfilling our responsibilities in the way I described, then we both create the training. Now, what I also said on the slide is that sometimes we can have an influence on someone without knowing that. And a possible way that might be happening right now is if I'd spilled some of my cup of tea down my shirt and I wasn't aware of that, and then the influence I may be having over you is that you're noticing that and you're curious as to why my shirt's covered in a brown stain in this session, unlike the others. And therefore you wouldn't really be fully concentrating and listening on what I was saying. I'd therefore be having quite an influence on you, and I'd have no idea that that was going on because I wasn't aware that I'd spilled my cup of tea down my shirt. Okay, with this idea in mind, I'm going to come on now and apply this idea to families affected by substance use, and to focus particularly on the relationship between a family member and the person they're concerned about who's got into difficulty with their substance use. And with that in mind, I'm going to come on to the second slide. Okay, with problematic or addictive substance use, families are often coerced into assisting someone else's substance use. Both someone who uses and their family members may or they may not be aware of this happening. So let's look at some possible ways in which someone may be coercing family members into assisting them in their substance use. It could be through their being charming so that you don't get that they're manipulating you. Possibly they might create enough uncertainty to be given the benefit of the doubt, such as someone who always seems to lose their mobile phone. Do they really lose it, or are they selling it to buy drugs? Possibly also apologising and promising to change, but they're never actually changing. Playing the victim everything is everyone else's fault, maybe appearing helpless as if they couldn't change, maybe pleading, lying and nagging, but also perhaps in some more sinister ways, such as manipulating, borrowing money that doesn't get paid back, stealing, using emotional blackmail, and in particular I've found the emotions of fear, guilt and shame get manipulated. Worse still, issuing threats, bullying, and possibly even using violence. So this kind of coercive behaviour can actually become abusive. Whatever way someone may be coercing their family members, the outcome is often the same, and that's that a family member ends up taking responsibility for the person who uses, and thereby assists their use. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about on this slide. Let's say there's a son who coerces his mother into giving him money to buy alcohol, and he does this by constantly nagging her. She is then coerced and gives him money, and he then buys alcohol and drinks it. So notice how both the mother and the son create the drinking. But it's very important to add to that, the mother's behaviour is influenced by the son's nagging, and the son's behaviour is influenced by his mother giving him the money. Now then, here's a really key part of this idea that it takes two to tango. The mother is responsible for being coerced by her son and giving them money, and it's the son who's then responsible for coercing her, for buying the alcohol and for drinking it. It's really important that you recognise that the mother is not responsible for his behaviour. It's not down to her that the son buys the alcohol and drinks it. What she is responsible for is being coerced and giving him the money. And she may or may not be aware that she is being coerced, and even if she is, it may be very difficult for her to say no. So what I'm not doing here is blaming the victim. You're not responsible for your loved one's substance use. There's one last point that I need to add. Whilst the mother is responsible for her decision to give her son money, she may also have her own reasons for doing so, such as if her son says he'll self-harm if he cannot drink and she's worried about his safety, or if he threatens her if she doesn't give him the money and she fears for her own safety, in which case it would be right that she acted to keep herself safe, even if she didn't want to give him the money. If so, it would be important for this mother to get further support and to know that other options are often possible. This is particularly true where a family member is fearful for the welfare of the person who's using, or indeed where they're concerned for their own safety. And if you're concerned as you watch this session for your own safety because of the possibility of arguments or threats or conflict, then I'd want to encourage you to watch session 10 on family arguments and conflicts. Now, the intention I have in sharing that with you isn't that you feel guilty. As I say, you're not responsible for the substance use of the person in your life. That's totally their responsibility. They're the only person who actually puts the stuff into their body. The intention I have is to share with you the idea that perhaps you have your part in what happens. And that if you know that, that's potentially useful. That can empower you. And with that in mind, I'd like to come on to the final slide. So, whilst family members can find noticing their part in what happens very uncomfortable, as I say, it could potentially empower them too. Whilst you cannot make someone else change, what you can change is the way you respond to their substance use. And this change may, in turn, influence the person who uses to change. So what I'm offering you is the idea that whilst you may have an unhelpful influence, you can also have a helpful influence too. And there's a couple of well-known phrases that I think capture the idea of this. The first one is, if you want to change someone, try changing yourself. Although you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So therefore, what I think those two phrases say is that families may have influence, with the person who's using, or they may not. At Adfam, we'd really like to encourage you to have a go at this, because very often families find that by changing the way they respond to the situation that they're in, they can feel more empowered and have a helpful influence over the situation that they find themselves in. Exactly how to use your influence in helpful ways is something that we will come on and look at in the following 3 sessions. Okay, I'd like to end the session by posing some questions for you. The first one is to consider, what does this mean for your relationship with the person you're concerned about who's got into difficulty with their substance use? And in particular, you might want to be thinking about, where's the balance of power in your relationship with them? But also, are you assisting their substance use in ways that maybe you know, or perhaps more likely you weren't aware of before? And if you are, how does that happen? Also, I suggest that you consider what support you might need in order to feel more empowered, and thereby be able to choose how you respond to the situation you're in, rather than just reacting. So therefore, finding the ability perhaps to say no, but also to have a more helpful influence with the person in your life who's using. So I suggest that you watch sessions numbers 7, 8 and 9, where we'll come back to this idea of how to use your influence in a helpful way. And then lastly, as ever, I'd like to encourage you to get support at what may well be a very difficult time in your life, and see elsewhere on the Adfam website for sources of support in your area. Okay, that concludes session number 6. Bye for now.